Saturday, August 28, 1978. Donnalee Duhamel leaves her two daughters with their grandmother and joins her boyfriend Jake at the Frigate Bar in Culver City, California, outside of LA.
He started playing pool, drinking beer. She started having conversation with some people at the bar.
Before long, the 32-year-old aspiring model catches the eye of a good-looking stranger.
One of the men had introduced himself as a photographer and was showing her page by page a photo album of pictures that he had taken.
The photographer suggests a photo session. Donnalee eagerly agrees.
Duhamel came over to the boyfriend and told him, hey, I'm living with him. He's gonna do some photographs of me.
Deep in a pool game, Jake encourages her to go.
It was his interpretation that she would be returning within a matter of minutes, that maybe they were just going outside to take some pictures.
But hours go by. No Donnalee. Jake waits until closing time at 2 a.m., but she never returns.
After so long of waiting there, her boyfriend finally left. Tried to find her, or call around, but, with no luck.
By the following day, Donnalee still hadn't shown up.
I was about 11 years old, and we would spend the weekends at my grandmother's house, and just one weekend she didn't come back. My grandmother called the police department.
Boyfriend started doing some inquiries and confined him until they submitted a missing persons report and the investigation began.
Los Angeles Sheriff's deputies questioned Jake and the rest of the Frigate Bar regulars. But the lights had been dim and the drinks were flowing. No one can give investigators a good description of the photographer. It wouldn't be the first time a woman left a bar with a stranger and stayed out all night, but her family knows something's very wrong.
I knew in the back of my mind my mom would never leave me.
We started to get worried about her, and time just went on, and we knew that something was wrong.
8 days later, and almost 30 miles away, a shocking discovery.
The jogger had found her body, and he had called the police. She was found in the Malibu Canyon in plastic bags and dumped about 50 feet down the side of a road.
Her head apparently was separated from her body, but they didn't know if that was from, if she was killed, if that was from that, or if it was just from natural causes.
She was badly decomposed. She had been mutilated. The cause of death in that case, it was the coroner's opinion that it was most likely due to strangulation. Dental records and fingerprints positively identify that was the body of Donna.
Detectives are desperate to solve this horrible crime. But after months of investigation, they fail to turn up any promising leads. There's a killer out there somewhere, and police can do absolutely nothing to stop him. Los Angeles, 1984. The Summer Olympics are in full swing. On the morning of July 6th, while the rest of the city celebrates, a store owner makes a disturbing discovery.
Remains of a female's body was found behind a business in West LA. She had been deposited there sometime overnight. She was wrapped in a blanket and just laid on the asphalt.
The victim appears to be in her early 20s. Her nude body has been bound with long leather shoelaces.
Her hands were bound in the front of her. There was a ligature, I believe, somewhere on her leg or ankle. She was approximately 120 pounds, and the cause of death was described as strangulation.
She had also been mutilated.
As I recall, she'd had some tattoos removed from her body. There was a tattoo, as I recall, on her abdomen. There was a tattoo on her ankle that had been cut off for whatever purpose.
The victim is taken to the LA coroner's office, identified as Jane Doe number 60.
There was no missing persons report immediately on file, thus causing her to remain a Jane Doe.
There were no other clues at the crime scene at all. It was pretty clear to the police as well as the coroner's office that she had not been killed there, that she had been transported from another scene and dumped.
As detectives open their investigation into the murder of Jane Doe number 60, a teenage girl goes missing just 5 miles away.
A young girl named Tracy Campbell was living in Culver City, the West LA area, whose family had recently moved from Montana to Los Angeles.
With school out for summer, 15-year-old Tracy had the house to herself.
We all had to go to work, and when we got home, the bedding was not picked up. The book that Tracy had been reading, she hadn't gotten very far in. And because we're creatures of habit, we knew something wasn't right.
She never went anywhere unless somebody knew. So for her just to be gone without a note or somebody knowing where she was going was just very unusual.
Her purse was found inside the apartment, and if she had left the apartment, her family believed that she would have normally taken her purse.
For hours, the Campbells wait, but Tracy never comes home.
The family was hysterical. They called West LA police, and they reported her missing.
The first thing police do is question the family. Tracy's cousin, Todd Heydrich, who lives with the Campbells, remembers that Tracy had had a visitor.
That photographer came to the apartment and was telling Tracy that there was some job or something that he had for her.
He waited until her family had left to go to work, and he went to her apartment, and he talked to her about taking photographs of her. And that was the last time anybody saw her alive.
I think every 15-year-old girl would be interested in something like that. California, this is where you make it big as an actor or a model, and so I think certainly I don't think she would have turned it down.
Todd tells police he knows the photographer. He lives in the building next door. What police find on the other side of the door will take the investigation in a haunting new direction.
He had a motorcycle and he drove a decent car, and he wore white t-shirts, rolled his cigarettes up in the sleeve of his t-shirt and stuff, and that was Bill, basically.
Investigators go to question Bradford, but according to his roommates, the photographer seems to be missing as well. The following day, an odd and disturbing note appears on Bradford's front door.
There had been a note left on his door by his roommate stating something like, you know, the girl next door is missing. I hope you didn't have anything to do with it. Something along those lines, which was kind of odd.
Everyone started to believe that Bill Bradford had something to do with Tracy's disappearance. The family had been looking for his car all night long. He never came home that night.
For the next 2 days, the Campbell family nervously awaits Bradford's return, hoping that Tracy could be with him.
It was very frustrating at first, just waiting and talking to people. He was like the only person we hadn't been able to ask any questions of. He finally did show up.
But he shows up alone. Tanya immediately confronts him.
Bill came to the door, and he was like a cat on a hot tin roof. I mean, he wouldn't look any of us in the eye. He was nervous and, you know, basically claiming he knew nothing and that he hadn't seen Tracy at all. Well, that's pretty much when we knew that something was wrong, that he knew something and he wasn't sharing it.
Investigators press Bradford for more information on Tracy's whereabouts.
That's when he made the statement that she had gone to get cigarettes and he dropped her off at the liquor store, and that's the last he's seen of her.
He's a liar. When he came to the door, why didn't he tell us that? He told us he hadn't seen her, didn't know where she was. Tracy would have taken her purse. That's where her money was. I mean, she was a girl who would carry a purse.
Furthermore, the cigarette story doesn't make sense.
There was a pack left there for her that morning when everybody had left for work, so she really had no reason to go to the store for more.
Suspicious of Bradford's story, detectives decide to run a background check on the photographer. What they find horrifies everyone.
Bradford was arrested on a rape of a young lady by the name of Julianne Peters, which occurred around that same time.
Julianne Peters was kind of a homeless girl living in his car. They stayed together for a few months. She finally decided to leave him, and one day she convinced her to go with him to the Lancaster area, where he brutally raped and tortured Mrs. Peters.
The rape of this woman who had been his girlfriend was as brutal as any rape I've heard. He made her drink poison, he beat her. I mean, he's just a vile, awful, worthless individual.
He was charged and bail was set. He was currently on bail when the Tracy Campbell case occurred.
Suspicions are mounting, but investigators don't have any hard evidence tying the photographer to the missing teenager.
The police got a search warrant and they searched Bill Bradford's apartment, and they searched his storage locker, and they searched his car.
They don't find a single link to Tracy Campbell's disappearance, but they do uncover a stash of photographs that only adds to their sense of urgency. Among the modeling shots, a familiar face. It's Donnalee Duhamel, the murder victim found in Malibu 6 years earlier.
The detectives did give my grandmother a call and wanted her to go down to the police station to identify some pictures.
They did say that they had found her picture at this man, Bill Bradford's house.
2 of the pictures were of my mother, but I did not recognize him, nor did I ever hear of his name before.
Could Bill Bradford have been the mysterious photographer who was with Donnalee the night she disappeared? Investigators suspect he's the same man, but they don't have a single shred of evidence linking him to Donnalee's murder. And meanwhile, no one is any closer to finding Tracy Campbell. As they continue searching Bradford's portfolio, Detective John Rockwood makes a haunting discovery. What appears to be a picture of another murder victim.
They were going through Bill Bradford's extensive photo collection looking at women. And John Rockwood saw a photograph of a young woman, tall, with long dark hair, standing in front of a rock formation, modeling. He noticed in the photograph that she had a tattoo over her ankle. So John Rockwood looked at this girl. He remembered that the body had skin excised over the ankle. And he went to Bradford and he said, "Who's the girl in this picture?" And Bradford said, "It's Sherry Miller."
Detectives run the name and get a hit.
Sherry Miller had a record with LAPD. I believe it was for misdemeanors. Her fingerprints were pulled. They were compared to the coroner's fingerprints.
That's when they backtracked and found out that Jane Doe 60 was Sherry Miller.
2 photos of 2 dead women. This terrifying discovery seems far more than mere coincidence. Investigators question Sherry's mother, desperate for any lead on the killer. At first, Mrs. Miller doesn't have much information to offer.
It wasn't unusual for her mother not to hear from her for a long period of time. And she was the kind of person where people weren't concerned if they didn't see her. She had no regular habits. She had no regular life.
Then, Sherry's mother remembers a detail from their last conversation.
Sherry had told her mother that she was going to meet with a photographer who was going to take pictures of her for a motorcycle magazine. She assured her mother that she wasn't going to do nude shots. Sherry also told her mother that she was going to meet the photographer at the Meat Market Bar in West LA.
Investigators head to the bar and question the barmaid who knew Sherry well.
Sherry really wanted to be a model. She was really sweet and really soft-spoken, just a really pretty girl. And everybody seemed to really like her in the bar.
Skylie O'Hare was able to establish that Bill Bradford had been at the bar on a certain date and that he'd taken photographs.
he said Bill, the photographer, was going to take some pictures of her.
Just as in the Donnalee Duhamel case, the last anyone saw of Sherry Miller, she was walking out of a bar for a photo shoot. Investigators take Bradford in for questioning, but the photographer doesn't flinch. And all police can prove is that he took pictures of two girls who ended up dead. With no new evidence, they are forced to release him.
There's a statutory time limit. You have to file charges within a certain amount of time or release somebody. There was not time to analyze what they had as far as evidence.
So everything leads to Bradford, but it's not conclusive and it's not enough to convict.
A very dangerous man is back on the street. 2 murders are unsolved, and Tracy Campbell has been missing for 5 days. But then, a field trip to the desert changes everything. Investigators in LA believe photographer Bill Bradford murdered Sherry Miller and is involved in the disappearance of Tracy Campbell. He's their prime suspect, but with insufficient evidence, their hands are tied, and Bradford walks free.
He was released, I think, within 48 hours, and he was then placed under surveillance, 24-hour surveillance at the time. It was undercover detectives in unmarked vehicles and non-obvious looking vehicles that would watch him and follow him wherever he went and keep a log of where he was going.
Meanwhile, investigators dig deeper into Bradford's past and find a troubling history.
Very early in Mr. Bradford's life, he became introduced to law enforcement. He started out as a juvenile offender, and he was actually arrested and convicted and did time in the California Youth Authority for crimes of property, burglary, and so forth. In the early 60s, incidents that involved sexual deviancy, indecent exposure, a lot of arrests involving drinking and drunk driving, exposing himself to young ladies, what's termed as sexual battery, illegal touching of women.
And even more disturbing, investigators learn that Bradford was the prime suspect in yet another murder, the strangling death of a 23-year-old man named Misha Stewart.
Bradford met Misha in a bar called the Pink Elephant, located in Culver City. After having several drinks, Bradford and Misha Stewart left the bar, and Bradford had a mobile home parked within a couple of blocks of the bar in an alleyway. The next morning, Misha Stewart's nude body was found in the entrance to this alleyway where Bradford's mobile home had been parked. Misha was nude. He had been strangled by a ligature. People that had been present at the bar described a person fitting Bradford's description as being the man that Misha Stewart left the bar with.
Investigators were never able to find enough physical evidence to prove Bradford committed murder, and the case against him was dropped. Now, detectives fear this predator will claim more lives unless they can find some way to stop him. Digging through their old files, they finally find an overlooked clue. The secret location 70 miles outside of LA, where Bradford allegedly raped his girlfriend.
The rape had occurred in a place in Lancaster that was off the road. It was like a bowl. It was a flat area of sand and scrub with a big hill behind it and a rock formation. And they had the picture of Sherry Miller, and there was a rock formation behind it.
She was standing on some rocks, some pretty distinctive looking rocks, and it appeared to be in the desert area.
Desperate for any shred of evidence, investigators head out to the desert to search for Bradford's lair. And what they discover will blow the investigation wide open. With hundreds of square miles to cover, police solicit the help of an old camping buddy of Bradford's named Nick Kloss.
I originally brought Bill out here. He got a motorhome. I had a motorhome, had a bunch of friends, a couple of girls and a couple of guys to team.
It's called the Antelope Valley, just straight out into the desert, and then off of a small side road. We're about a half a mile directly into the desert. It's like a box canyon, small bowl area here that once you've driven up into it and parked your vehicle or a motorhome or whatever, you couldn't be seen from anywhere, from any road, and you're miles and miles and miles from any residence or civilization.
Sergeant Adams asks Kloss for help in finding Bradford's regular camping spot.
They said, would you take us out in the desert where you were with Bill? And I said, sure.
He essentially gave us a general locale of where they encamped. We then took sheriff's mounted posse and reserves and took LAPD. We had a command post, and I believe we had a helicopter. It was pretty much an all-day operation out here at that time.
Even with a giant posse and the help of Nick Kloss, the search for the rock is still a daunting task.
Nick brought us to this location, and we gave the mounted reserve posse photographs with Sherry Miller standing in front of the rock and told them we were trying to identify that particular formation and that location.
After a long day of searching, investigators finally get a shout from Kloss.
I just happened to know where the place was. And if he'd have done it a couple hundred yards up here, I wouldn't have thought of it.
It was a real distinctive looking rock with a crack in it. We found the rock.
Investigators are thrilled with their discovery, but horrified by what they find next. Police have found the exact spot where Bill Bradford took pictures of murder victim Sherry Miller.
They had a photograph of Sherry. They looked up at the rocks, they held up the photograph, and they matched. It was the exact same rock formation.
Scouring the area for clues, investigators make a gruesome discovery. Just 100 feet from the rock.
In this little hollow area in here, we found the mostly decomposed body of what turned out to be Tracy Campbell.
It was very badly decomposed. The hair was still there. She had blonde hair. Her arms were gone, her legs were gone, most of her torso was gone. She was mummified.
Some of these flat rocks were piled on top of her, a few of them. Some of the sagebrush was piled on top. And part of her had been dragged out by animals and such, and she'd had a ligature or a blouse tied around her face and neck.
This remote desert location now ties Bradford to the rape of Julianne Peters, to the murder of Sherry Miller, and to the mutilated body of his 15-year-old neighbor, Tracy Campbell. But there's even more compelling evidence linking Bradford to both murders. The blouse found on Tracy's body belonged to Sherry Miller.
I mean, how did Sherry's shirt get on Tracy's head? They had never met, ever. And Los Angeles is a huge city.
Ultimately, the police took that piece of clothing and they showed it to friends of Sherry Miller. And the friends of Sherry Miller said, that's Sherry's blouse. They were able to tie both murders together.
Back in LA, investigators quickly tracked Bradford down at the Meat Market Bar, the very same place where he first met Sherry Miller.
He was arrested at night. They came and just grabbed him and took him away. Well, he went willingly because he was sure that he had gotten away with perfect crimes.
Bozanich successfully argues to combine the Tracy Campbell and Sherry Miller murder cases into one trial.
The two cases were tied together so tightly that even though the defense tried to have them tried separately, there was no way to do it, because evidence of Tracy would be admissible in Sherry's trial, and evidence of Sherry would be admissible in Tracy's trial.
Though the prosecution has no witnesses and no smoking gun, the circumstantial evidence in the Sherry Miller case is staggering.
Now, Sherry also had a knife and some other pieces of jewelry that Bradford stole from her. And those were found in his storage locker in the apartment building where he lived in West Los Angeles. And we had a number of witnesses who could come in and say, yeah, that's Sherry's knife, that's Sherry's this or that. They found a pair of boots that were consistent with Sherry's shoe size, which I seem to recall as a 9. The laces that would have fit the boots were consistent with the ties that were on Sherry's body. So he took her boots apart and he tied her with the laces to her boots.
Another critical piece of evidence is a watch found in Bradford's apartment. It contains yellow paint from a job Sherry worked just days before her death.
When the police did their search warrant, they found a wristwatch that was a Mickey Mouse wristwatch, and it had paint in it, yellow paint, which was consistent with the paint that had been taken from the house in the valley that she'd painted. When Sherry's body was found, there was yellow paint under her fingernails, and we were able to establish that that paint was the same consistency, the same kind of paint from the house that she'd painted.
There's less physical evidence in the Tracy Campbell murder, but Bozanich puts together a compelling case.
You have a missing girl who's a neighbor of his who was last seen in his presence. You have her wallet inside of the house and a story from the defendant that he took her to buy cigarettes with no money. And so once you put the two cases together, it was a fabulously intricate but perfect circumstantial evidence case.
It was an emotional trial for everyone, the families of the murdered girls and for the prosecutor.
Sherry's mother was in the courtroom when we had the crime scene photos there, and I had to go tell her that her daughter's body had been mutilated. It was awful. She was, of course, horrified.
The worst part was they let my mom go in and hear opening statements. And when she came out, she was just shaking and really upset because he had just been staring her down. I mean, just giving her dirty looks. I mean, it was just terrifying for her to be in that room with him.
But without hard evidence, the prosecution knows there's a chance this dangerous predator could beat the system.
He was truly evil. He was like a terrorist. He did on one occasion. I was walking in the courtroom and the other lawyers were up at the bench talking to the judge. And Bradford was sitting in his chair and he jumped up and he started walking towards me before the bailiff could get to him. And he said to me, "Are you wearing your falsies today?" And I looked at him and I said, "No, I grew these myself." And the bailiff got him and sat him back down.
Bradford's bizarre behavior in the courtroom makes headlines, especially when he fires his lawyers and starts representing himself.
Bill fired his attorney so he could question me himself. I believe that was so he could intimidate me. They had police all over the courtroom where he couldn't get me, and they had him shackled. And I was scared, but I wasn't too scared to tell him the things that he'd done to me, so that they know that he was capable of doing the things that he did to other people. First of all, I got pregnant. He tried to slam my stomach in the door at one time, and I pulled out everything but my hand, and my fingers were, this half was on one side of the door and this half was on the other side of the door. The door closed. I had to have my fingers sewed back on, and that was meant for my stomach.
Bradford ruthlessly cross-examines his ex-wife.
When he questioned me, it was very scary. And he'd ask me questions that would make me have to say some of the things that I did, like posing for the pictures or things like that, things to degrade me.
The case goes to the jury, but it isn't an easy deliberation. 21 days pass without a decision.
The jury came back after 3 weeks of deliberation. And I remember sitting in court, and even though I was confident, my heart was pounding so hard the blood was flowing through my ears, I couldn't hear.
Finally, the jury comes back with a verdict.
And after we heard the first guilty, it's like, oh God, we got him.
It didn't surprise me. I think at that point, pretty sure he was a serial killer.
The trial now moves into the penalty phase.
In the penalty phase, the trial's all about him. Who are you? Why should we kill you, and why should we spare you? And I was waiting. I wanted to see, how did this monster come to be? And ultimately, we never learned what it was.
Bradford refuses to defend his actions or plea for leniency. Instead, he taunts the jurors.
The defendant is allowed to go last in the penalty phase, so that's the last thing the jury hears. So they get sort of the benefit of the last word. And Bradford stood up after David Kahn had argued he should be executed and said, he's right. Think of all the others you don't know about.
I think that's a chilling statement to make, you know, during the stand up in front of the jury who's going to decide whether you live or die, and to tell them, might as well kill me because there's a lot more you don't even know about, essentially, is what he's saying.
He was good at covering up his tracks. And even with the ones that they found, I don't think they found them all.
Bill Bradford is sentenced to death. Even then, his shocking outbursts aren't over.
Following Bill Bradford's sentencing, he called in one of the LAPD officers into the court lockup and essentially admitted to killing Misha Stewart.
But if Bradford is angling for another high-profile trial, he isn't going to get it.
I wrote what's called a reject, which means we're not going to file charges on this against Bradford for this murder. And the reason we weren't is the case wasn't good enough. And we already had him convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was already on death row.
Bill Bradford heads to San Quentin's notorious death row.
Bill took the lives of people he had no right to take the lives of. I think he should have been put to death. Right then and there.
Nearly 22 years after the murders of Sherry Miller and Tracy Campbell, LA County sheriffs crossed paths with Bill Bradford one more time. In July of 2006, an unsolved homicide strikes a familiar chord.
One of our detectives was looking through an unsolved homicide case, and he thought that the MO was a little bit familiar with the Bradford case because he'd been back far enough that he remembered the Bradford case. So he pulled the Bradford case and pulled the file out of our library.
And what I found was that there were an awful lot of photographs of women in various stages of dress and undress sexual activity. Here's this man who boasted basically to a jury in court that you'll never know how many I killed, and we have all these photos. Let's see what we can do to determine their well-being, or to see if possibly there are other victims.
Could Bill Bradford have claimed more victims? To find out, the LA Sheriff's Department digs into the dark secrets of Bill Bradford's photograph collection once again. 22 years after the murders of Tracy Campbell and Sherry Miller, the LA Sheriff's Department unearths hundreds of photos belonging to Bill Bradford.
The pictures were put in a box somewhere, but they were, I would say, misplaced for a period of time.
They appear to be a lot of photos of women. Some were like professional models posing in bathing suits. Others were pornographic. There were graphic sex acts being performed, men and women involved.
We researched the case and we couldn't find out anything that tell us that somebody did something to identify those females. So our goal is to identify them all alive and well, if it is possible.
There was only one thing to do, and that was find out if these additional women were victims of Bradford or not.
The Sheriff's Department calls a dramatic press conference.
We put together a board with 47 different women, I believe it was. We took it to the press. We got a great deal of attention for this case.
The media approved our best asset in getting the information out to the public during a press conference in mid-July of 2006.
We've received, I believe, totally in excess of 5,000 phone calls and emails.
The release of this information to the public was overwhelming. Our phones started ringing here in the office, and they didn't stop. The initial response to the internet website caused it to crash.
The public identifies half of the women showcased.
I was on there. He took pictures of people that were around our lives at the time that I was with him that I had no idea he had taken pictures of. So I know he spent time with them. There's other women wearing my clothing and stuff.
Number 28 on the bulletin board is Donnalee Duhamel, the woman found dead in Malibu nearly 30 years ago.
It was devastating. I broke down at work. I was trying to get out of work before I started crying, but I didn't really make it.
I let go of my mom's murder and I tried to move on. When there was no resolution, I always wanted resolution. I wanted someone to be convicted for her murder.
After a lifetime of unanswered questions, the victims' daughters want to see Bradford prosecuted for their mother's murder.
We're all hoping that by keeping the story alive, that they'll continue to work on the case, and hopefully we'll get the answers that we're looking for.
In response to the outpouring of information, the Sheriff's Department releases 2 more poster boards.
We're still working leads generated from the release of the initial information, so we're not short on leads. However, we've to date been able to identify 5 individuals off the second board, both male and female.
The investigation is ongoing today.
We continue to follow up each and every lead. You know, I'm still sending detectives all over the country as warranted, and we are making progress.
Bill Bradford remains on death row, but an execution date has not been set.
There's no race. I understand that there's an appeal process that he is currently undergoing. He will still be alive when I retire from this job, so there's no urgency, once again, in rushing to get this interview conducted with him.
Bradford's killing spree is over, but for the families, the horror and the heartache will never end.
One of the biggest lessons that I learned from all this is the bad guys don't wear black. You can't pick them out of a crowd.
My thought is he's a cold-blooded monster. To be able to do this and no feeling. Heartless, not human.
I lock myself in my house at night, and I've got to make sure every single thing is locked up. I'm terrified every day that this man's going to get out and he's going to get me, or he's going to get my children, or he's going to have somebody do it.
Over 20 years later, it's a case no one will forget.
When you work murders, you have to think of victims as being a piece of evidence, because you can't, if you personalize things too much, you go nuts. You know, especially for a 15-year-old girl to have met her end out there, and you wonder how long she had been kept out there, what she went through. You know, those are the kinds of things you almost have to put out of your mind.
As a child, I was afraid of evil. The whole concept of evil scared me, and one of the reasons I became a prosecutor is I wanted to confront my fears. And the Bradford trial was a test of that, because he was evil.